Hello and welcome to Adventures in AI, where the InsightFlow team members share things that have caught our attention over the past week and talk about our own experiences in the world of AI. I'm Giles.
I'm Rich.
And I'm Graham. I'm Giles. As the serious member here, I gather you've now actually decided to find some fun and games in multi-modal models. I can't even say it. Multi-modal
Easy
models.
for you to say. I'm hoping that by the time I've talked about it for a few minutes, I'll be able to say it as well. So yeah, this is talking about different kinds of models that are coming out. And it's not really individual models. It's more the way those are now being deployed. So OpenAI announced this week that they're adding capabilities to GPT that will allow it to read files and images directly and also to generate images. And they also separately demonstrated the ability to talk to an assistant and get it to do things on your behalf by calling APIs. So their assistant has a much more realistic sounding voice than assistants like Siri. And I guess, you can kind of think of that voice interaction as the next generation of Siri and, OK Google and those types of assistants. So, although it's been technically possible to talk to a machine, get it to do things, I think the big difference is the ease of development for these types of multimodal assistants. So before it was only really the big guys that were able to create these kind of assistants. And by giving developers tools that allow them to really easily create assistants and allow users to interact in the way that they feel most comfortable with or the way that's most appropriate given whatever environment they're in, I think it has the ability to completely transform the way that we interact with computers.
There's a thing that's always been the case about it, as long as computers have been around, and probably before that, this question about how data is put into the systems as being one of the big limitations, and the fact we've still got keyboards and the fact we've still got keyboards that are actually QWERTY keyboards, way beyond after the need for the QWERTY layout, is an indicator that they still haven't actually nailed this idea of how we interact with our machines.
So this is a little bit of a tangent, but it's kind of interesting. So the reason, in a similar vein to QWERTY keyboard, is only there to stop the hammers from crashing into each other, as I'm sure you know. There's a similar thing that on the genesis of technology. So where does it come from originally? Which is why the width of railway tracks is what they are. And the width of railway tracks is the width that they are because the carriage wheels in Roman times were a certain width. And you can see if you go to places like Pompeii what the carriage wheel widths are. So I always think it's fascinating that you can see from where things came from, and there will eventually become a point where trains float using maglev or some other technology, and therefore the width of the tracks won't matter anymore. But it comes all the way from there. Anyway, sorry, that was a bit of an aside, but So I think I agree. I think the difference in the way that we interact with computers is quite fundamental. If humans are no longer the main inputters of information into a computer, then that completely transforms how we work with them. And for me, I think there's sort of three key things that it will change. So the first is, instead of a human actually being the interaction with the computer, it's the AI. So, we'll interact with the AI in the same way that we interact with a coworker and friends. So, in the old world, if you were asking somebody to can you do some data entry for me, for example, then we can ask the AI to do that instead. And when the best way to communicate with the computer is to write, we'll do that. But most of the time we'll talk to it because it's more efficient and generally we feel more comfortable doing it. And then sometimes we'll draw pictures. So, what does this mean in terms of the design of offices and workstations if everyone is talking all the time? For example, if I'm sitting next to somebody particularly loud, or should I say particularly loud, will that cause problems with the AI understanding what I'm telling it to do? So, it'll get confused because my instructions are mixed up with Graham, who happens to be shouting next to me. It even starts to ask questions like, will I even need a computer, or will a smartphone and a big screen that it's attached to be enough to do everything that I need to do?
I think apart from the idea of me being a shouter, I think that we've all been in offices where that one person on the phone who is the least self-conscious in the office is the noisiest has been a problem. And I still strongly suspect that that purely voice command and purely voice input feels like a long way off with most of the people I know. I suspect that there's a privacy of the keyboard and the screen that will take a long time to escape. But of course, the counterpoint to that is that pre-computer, there was a whole generation of managers who were entirely used to the idea of dictating letters and dictating memos and dictating stuff to human secretaries who were taking it down. So I may well be the oddity here, and we're reverting back to behaviours that we had pre-computer.
Well, I think, and that's really...
I think we've seen in lots of offices nowadays where you do have those telephone rooms, and at the moment they're probably just a handful on each floor. But I think you're right, maybe that needs to be expanded, or everyone needs access to those if we're going to interact with computers verbally on a day-to-day basis. And actually, the evolution of how that happens is probably more along the lines of, there are so-called telephone rooms that people go to when they want to talk to AI, and gradually they become more and more numerous until everybody has one.
Yeah, no, I mean, effectively, if you look at the offices of the 1950s and 60s, they were built with everyone having an office. And it was only, if you were in some organizations in the US in particular, it was cubicles. So everyone had a kind of slightly soundproofed and private cubicle, but they were, the walls didn't go all the way up to the ceiling. So I think, there's a distinct possibility that actually we're going to have to kind of go back to the kind of office space that we had before, or think of a different way of doing it, like everyone work from home. Now, of course, that assumes that there isn't another interface which is direct plugging into the brain, which I'm sure Elon Musk would be very happy about, but for the time being, I don't think that's quite yet there. So the second thing for me was, this idea of going deskless. So instead of us doing something on a computer, the AI will do things for us and can have access to all of the systems and services that we normally use. So, at a personal level, some of this already exists with Amazon Alexa and Google Home services, where you can connect apps and control them by voice. So you can get it to kind of turn on the radio or add something to your shopping order or your calendar. So this is fairly basic and quite prescriptive. And if you add a layer of intelligence between the request and the service being used, it should actually improve the user experience quite a bit. And also, probably more importantly, from a business perspective, allow much more complex tasks to be achieved. So, in a work environment, if I'm trying to pull together a report, I can ask the AI to do any research I need, to pull data from a number of different systems and pull that together in a report illustrated with pictures and formatting, using a company template or something like that. So all I need to be able to do then is explain what I need in much the same way as, if I had a project team working for me and I went, right, can you go off and do this? You go off and do that. And that means no more mouse, no more keyboard, no more fighting with trying to get, slides or PowerPoint to actually put things in the right place for you. No more worrying about system logins. That one might be a stretch, but so once it's set up, the AI can handle all of that stuff for me, and I can sit in a cafe or on a train with just my phone and still be highly productive, which, I think sounds quite appealing personally.
So I think I'm going to give away here how lazy I am. But an actual genuine quality of life improvement for me has been smart light bulbs. I tell Alexa when I want to turn the light off, so I don't have to get out of bed. But I think that's probably a really neat example of, you still do the complicated stuff. So the hard bit would be knowing when I would need the light off, and the easy stuff, actually going to flick the switch, anyone could do. So that's it's making sure that you can focus your energy and attention on the harder tasks and leave the everything else to be automated.
In fact, and I'm going to talk about this later, Musk talks about exactly that division of the stuff that's the things we just don't want to do particularly, or are boring or repetitive, what have you, and freeing up humans to do the things we do want to do. So I do think there's in there. I do like the idea, Giles, of not having logins, though, even if you reckon it's going to be difficult.
Yeah, no, that would be brilliant. I mean, I think the interesting logical conclusion of that is that essentially the only value of a human is a brain. So once AI is doing everything else for us, then we can just be a brain in a jar, and actually the rest of it doesn't really matter. Which doesn't so that then we have to decide how to use our bodies in ways that are not necessarily useful from a work perspective, but useful from a personal or kind of social perspective. So then the third thing, and this I guess sort of illustrates the point about brain in a jar. That we all effectively become managers with superpowers. So in this future world, which is actually not that future, it's probably the next 12 to 18 months, we'll start to see real strides in this direction. Basic computing skills like Microsoft Office and using specific business systems like accounting and other things will become much less important. So we'll probably still need experts in these for a while. But actually, the majority of workers who were never experts in them will be able to delegate that to the AI. And that means that effectively everyone becomes a manager of the AI or AIs that are working on their behalf. So if you then think about, well, what skills do the next generation of employees need? They need to be good at getting the AI to do what they need. And this is it's a completely different skill set to getting a computer to do what they need, because and I can never remember the right way around, but it's computers are deterministic, I think, in that there's computer says no or yes, right? Whereas AI is non-deterministic, it's probabilistic, and therefore you get shades of grey. So actually getting it to do the right thing to the right quality becomes a skill in itself, and it's a skill that you can learn, as we know from kind of learning prompt engineering. So I think it's also worth noting that AI is actually very good at helping with planning tasks. So ChatGPT, actually, I've noticed in the last 3 to 4 months, there's a methodology where you do the plan first and then act. I think it's called plan act, imaginatively. And so you can see ChatGPT going, right, here are the things that you need to think about, which really is, here are the things that ChatGPT needs to think about. And that keeps it in line with answering or helping you with the task that you're trying to do. So it means that even people who may struggle to know what to do or what steps to take will actually be able to use the AI to help with that. So it means things like, someone coming into a new organization doesn't know what the processes are, doesn't know anything about the organization, can actually become productive much, much faster. And the ability of people in the team to execute to a higher standard, regardless of their ability, cognitive ability or otherwise, will actually be quite significantly enhanced, I think.
So I actually think in terms of, you reminded me there about onboarding new staff, and I think we've touched on it previously in one of the podcasts. I think actually increasingly AI and how you interact with AI is going to filter its way through onto job descriptions and CVs. So just like you might see, you need to be proficient with the Microsoft suite. for this job, I think that's going to filter through too. You need to be able to get AI to do the things we need it to do.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, it's very similar to, it used to be typing was kind of fairly important. Things like punch cards and stuff like that were a very small group of people that had to become expert in those. But then suddenly you go from that to pretty much everyone needing to know how to use a computer, knowing how to use a smartphone. And suddenly you could end up in a situation where, the tools that certainly, I've used all of my career, suddenly aren't as important anymore. And I think that's pretty significant shift. Which, I guess I think there's a whole topic that we could talk about on the potential implications this has on society more broadly as well, actually. In OpenAI's Dev Day, the way Sam Altman described the future of AI was that it'll elevate the human race by giving everyone tools that have cognitive abilities of a top university graduate. He didn't say that specifically, but that was kind of the implication. And I think that's a really appealing perspective. If we can make everyone perform at the level of the top university graduate, brilliant. But I think as with all disruptive technologies, and AI, I think, is extremely disruptive. It'll also devalue many of the things that currently give people a sense of worth in society. So if I've built my work identity around the fact that I'm the expert in the finance system, and suddenly an AI can do it all for me, or I've become a developer, and that's where I kind of generate my self-worth. It's going to be really difficult for society to see the level of change that's going to happen in a short period of time. And I think managing that transition is going to be a real challenge. I would say the tech industry has a habit of leaving someone else to deal with that kind of thing. So I think that brings us quite neatly onto the steps that governments are taking to address some of those challenges. So I know, Graham, you were keen to talk about the AI security conference that the UK government hosted recently.
Yeah, and it was obviously in the news and big news over the last week or so. In fact, the bit of it that I particularly want to focus on, because I think it was a really interesting view into these respective worlds, was the conversation interview between Rishi Sunak and Elon Musk, who sat down at the end of the conference and did an on-screen conversation. Now, it's kind of worth listening to. It's 52 minutes of it. And it was interesting for a number of reasons. And I started listening.
I thought you'd listen to it for us, so we didn't have to listen to it ourselves. Is that not how it works?
Well, yes. I mean, I'm hoping to give most of the highlights of it, and therefore you don't need to listen to Rishi Sunak creeping up to Elon Musk too much.
Excellent.
And I was fascinated by it because my impression of what I've heard reportedly that Elon Musk has said is deep pessimism about AI and about its impact on humanity. And obviously, coming at the back of a security conference, there was a very much a thread about the threat and the threats of what AI is going to do. And Elon Musk was fascinating in it, I was quite impressed by what he was saying. I mean, he basically had three major areas where he was sort of looking at where that threat was coming. And the first example he gave, and perhaps the most obvious one in many ways, is that of deep fake, the power of AI to produce utterly convincing replicas of people saying things that are utterly under the tool of the creator rather than those people has, I think, obvious bad potential should it be in the hands of bad actors. And it's really interesting that one, actually, they didn't really talk about a solution. And I think that solutions to it are incredibly difficult. But I also think that there's a a sort of really interesting side thought here that fakery in media has been with us as long as media has existed. Whether it's the first printing presses in the 16th century churning out propaganda pamphlets that are lies, that are full of lies. You've got amusingly, at the beginning of the 20th century, the Cottingley fairies. Now, if you don't know about the Cottingley fairies, go and have a look at them. They are brilliant. But this pair of girls who at the time I think was sort of something like 16 and 9 were using cameras to fake interactions with fairies. And they put these out, and adults later on picked them up and treated them as if they were completely real. And treated them as proof of all sorts of spiritualist and various other aspects. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle famously was using Cottingley fairy pictures to prove spiritualism. So people have always misused media, and there's been this reliance on credulous readers to knowingly or unknowingly spread lies and disinformation. So I'm not sure that the deep fake thing is new. I mean, it's obviously more sophisticated. It's obviously using 21st century technology and the power of AI to produce it and churn it out and increasingly make it look unbelievably real is definitely something that our society is going to have to deal with, our governments are going to have to deal with. But I feel that it's part of an ongoing trend on that particular area. And the response is probably similar to the response it's always been, that we need to be educating people about the possibilities that what they're seeing or reading may not be true. And we have to encourage a degree of sort of skeptical consumption. But at the end of the day, some people are going to want to believe, some people are going to want to deceive. And that combination will be a powerful part of society.
I don't know about both of you, but I've definitely, and this has only been in the last, say, 4 or 5 months, noticed deep fake, well, I guess bad actors acting badly, mostly in the form of kind of shorts. And I think it's always been a fake of the Joe Rogan podcast where he's saying something and usually it's trying to lead you down to a link that's obviously a scam. But at the moment, I do notice within about, say, 4 or 5 seconds, but it does take me a little while, and it's only through looking at his lips aren't quite moving naturally that I realise. And you're right, Graham, it is going to get to the point where people won't realise, and that the only solution to that is then the education.
I think the interesting thing, we've always, or for quite a long time online, assumed that text might have been created by a bad actor, and even then, I remember receiving invoices actually when I was at the BBC that were for $1 million. I think it was £1 million for Oracle, from what looked like from Oracle, and you have to look at it and go, is that real or not? And that's been easy to do for sort of 10, 15 years. And people still fall for those kind of scams. And the only way you capture that and stop it is, as you say, by educating people. I think that what's different is being able to use the likeness of a human being, and do that at scale, at speed, kind of on an industrial scale. I think is where it gets quite scary, because it's people have tried to pretend to be someone's spouse or pretend to be a member of their family to try and get money out of people. That's been going on for a while, and I think the scammers will always be creative in the way that they do it. They'll always try and use new tools in the same way that entrepreneurs do to achieve their goals. But yeah, I think it's the scale and the low cost of it that's probably the scariest part.
I think what's interesting in that, and at risk of using an argument that the NRA use across the water, The idea that it's the not the gun but the person that's the problem.
Rapper.
I do feel that there's quite a lot of truth.
Rich knew the reference. Graham obviously didn't.
Yeah.
No.
I'll enlighten you. Guns don't kill people. Rappers do. It's a song.
Right.
I heard it on a documentary on BBC Two.
Okay. I mean, I do think there's a lot of truth in the fact that quite a lot of the threat from AI actually comes from the combination of AI and bad actors. And I haven't heard anybody sensibly articulate the sort of singularity arguments that bad AI will take over our world yet. I mean, it may well come and people may well articulate it, but I don't see that happening. The second area that Musk pulled out as being of a threatening nature, and particularly in the context of the security conference, was the idea that AI is progressing so very quickly that it's almost impossible for any regulator to keep up. And he said that governments were necessarily slower from their very nature in responding. Now, yeah, I was going to say the context of the conference was that it should be government or governments that provided a solution, and Musk was very, very keen on the idea of what he called the external safety check. This idea that says that, and where external is external to the AI industry, that new things going out should be put through a filter that is not the AI industry. And I think that they were talking about this idea that this speed of progression was such that the impacts were going to come more quickly, bad or good, and in a security conference context, bad being the focus one. It was also interesting that in this context, they were also talking about whether open source was different or should be viewed differently from proprietary code bases. Musk suggests that open source is actually about 6 to 12 months behind proprietary systems. So the stuff we don't have access to every day is even more advanced than the open source stuff that we're all talking about. And he also suggested that open source in this speedy world was a huge risk because by its nature it opened up code base to bad actors, whereas people who own tools, who are building proprietary systems, have much more control. But what was really interesting about that was, they talked at length in the security conference about this and didn't actually really come up with the solution. This idea of the external safety check is clearly quite important. But I didn't get the impression that Elon Musk truly believed that a government could plausibly provide that external safety check, and I suspect that he would like it to happen somewhere else.
What, like a company that he founds?
Almost certainly.
I think, Graham, your point about open source being 6 to 12 months behind at the moment, and that's absolutely true, and it absolutely makes a huge difference at the moment. But the way I like to think of it, it's the evolution of screen resolutions. Like, we jumped to full HD, that was a big obvious improvement, and we've jumped to 4K. That's a considerable improvement as well. But actually, I don't know if you've seen an 8K screen. You're getting to the point where it's not making as big a difference as the previous jumps before it. And when we get to that stage with the AI models, open source being 6 to 12 months behind probably isn't going to make a huge amount of difference. So that is probably a point in time where a lot more people may be seriously considering it.
I think, that's a good analogy, actually. I actually don't think the open source ones are as far behind. So some of them are actually now getting ahead in specific scenarios. Now, this is obviously what I'm not talking about here is, for example, Tesla's self-driving AI where they may have some tech in there that we just don't know about. But in terms of things like OpenAI and the models like that are commercial, but are ones that are kind of able to be used by the rest of the world, I think, you're not seeing so much of a difference between things like that and Llama now. So I think there are some kind of there is some catching up going on. I think the other interesting thing about this point is what's the role of a government and how does it regulate? Because for me, there's a piece that says actually regulating social media algorithms is something that governments have never had to do before. Regulating human-like behavior, bad or good, is something that actually governments have got thousands of years of law on their side to do. And so and if you accept the premise that an AI actually behaves much more like a human does, then the legal frameworks that you can use and the kind of knowledge that the legal industry has on how you write legislation to deal with that kind of thing actually becomes potentially easier than some of the other things they've been having to deal with recently. It doesn't mean it's easy, but it, you can think about it in a slightly different way. So I think that the second problem you then have is responsibility. So who's responsible for an AI going rogue? And I think that's the part they need to deal with first, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, I think my own personal cynicism about it, perhaps slightly shaped by the legislation through the digital age, where it was always felt as though it was 4 or 5 years behind, is the fact that the best will in the world legislative process is going to put them behind the drag curve. That it's quite difficult. Yeah, legislation by its nature tends to be reactive, and if you've got a 12 to 18 month minimum window from framing law and getting it through the legislative process and what have you, and you're reacting something, you're effectively reacting to something that's 1 to 2 years old in a world where things are changing very quickly. The final area that Musk was talking about as being potentially a threat was what he called the rise of digital superintelligences. And he's saying that, in really fundamental areas like transportation, aviation and cars, the rise of superintelligence was likely, if not already, happening. Now, clearly, the cars bit is talking to his deep interests. And once again, though, he was talking about this idea that said that as we hand over responsibility for safety in aviation, in cars and what have you, to digital superintelligences, AIs, the idea then that bad actors could intervene and take over, or intervene and harm, or intervene and corrupt those digital superintelligences became plausible, but also became much more damaging. The idea that these superintelligences could be subverted is one of the big areas of risk. Now, it's quite interesting that Musk didn't actually really suggest that he saw it as a huge problem in and of itself, unsurprisingly, given what else he does. And his sort of illusion was that actually what he suggested was that it was a good thing that we were handing over some of this stuff to superintelligences, because what he suggested, and in fact we've already touched on it to a degree in this podcast, that the superintelligences could pick up those thankless tasks that humans don't want to do, and he actually talked about the threat, but didn't talk about any type of solution in this. And I'm not sure what sort of solution it is, but in fact, what he did actually say is that in the not too distant future, it's completely plausible that humans wouldn't need to work. Again, echoing, Giles, what you were saying earlier. And of course, he didn't see this.
Are you suggesting managers don't work?
Well, the point being that they don't need to work, and I think possibly coming out, possibly slightly beyond the immediate future that we tend to talk about in Adventures in AI. The the idea that there's a point in the future where humans won't need to work, and where they do work, it's because they want to, or because they're having fun, or because they're doing something that's a challenge to them. And in fact, as the person of the three of us whose job it is to cite science fiction wherever possible, I was pleased to see that Musk cited Ian M. Banks and his culture novels as an articulation of what humanity would look like in a world where AI was doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And as a complete fan of Banks, I applaud that reference. But the final part of that thought process was basically, look, it's going to be a good thing, but the problem comes, as ever, is when bad actors start to intervene and misuse those powers. And the greater the powers, the greater the potential for bad actors to misuse them.
It's quite funny, actually. So the AI security conference, it was on the news, and the guest that they had on, I think, they were almost explaining the plot to Terminator with Skynet. It's to saying how big a threat it could be. And my dad said to the TV, "Oh, don't be stupid, just pull the plug out." But I think those two points of view are the two extremes, and the reality is somewhere in the middle. Like, obviously, with the cloud, you can't just pull the plug out if you've integrated AI with certain tools and you've been able to send that. Potentially, that's gone out there. But at the same time, I think you can metaphorically pull the plug out in terms of the tools and what access that you grant to the AI. So, for example, AI is not going to have access to the nuclear launch codes, or at least we'd certainly hope so.
I think what's difficult about it is if you've got bad actors who are looking to take over, potentially using AI as a tool to help them find vulnerabilities in systems, and because AI is actually highly fluent in code, then it's probably going to have a pretty good chance of finding vulnerabilities, and therefore the risk does increase, I think. And I think, Graham, the point you made is probably the critical one, which is the more powerful the tools, the more dangerous it is when they get in the wrong hands. So, if you go back to prehistoric times, the first guy that discovered that a flint makes quite a good tip for a spear had an advantage until the guy next to him nicked it and stabbed him. And it's that sort of, that's kind of hardwired into human behavior as much as anything else. But it means that the for want of a better phrase, the good guys will always have to find ways to protect themselves against the bad guys, and that sometimes means being stronger at the things that the bad guys do.
Yeah. I think within that, at the risk of sort of extending this out slightly longer, I think it is plausible to suggest areas where these types of things may happen. So the one that I always use when I'm talking about it is the risk of, so take a situation where it is entirely plausible to suggest, and in fact I know it's happening, that financial organizations are using AI to help their trading, and that those AIs are rewarded and improved based on the speed and accuracy and profit making of those trades that they're doing. Equally, I know that within the securities market and what have you, there are AIs now that are helping drive pricing and helping actually do the market making part of the market, making the market, the function that was once done by the stock jobbers and stock brokers in the stock exchange, as an example. Now, we've seen plenty of occasions where AIs have cheated on tests, and the idea that those two separate AIs should start to collude, that the trading-based AI and the market-making-based AI start to collude, I think is actually quite plausible. And at that point, they will be operating on their own reward system, not for the benefit necessarily of anything else, and certainly not in the idea of a free market would be tried to be established in that process. So I think you can point to particular areas where instances of AIs joined together or communicating with each other has a real risk.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest example would be, we have the first drone war going on now in Ukraine, and people getting hold of or co-opting drones for their own purposes or whatever becomes really dangerous.
So talking about the news that's been happening this week, the other big news in the AI world was the OpenAI Dev Day, from which I've seen huge amounts of reports. Now, Rich, I think you've got a few thoughts to pick up from that.
Yeah, so there's obviously been a huge buzz this week around Dev Day. One of the large reasons for that has been GPTs. So I wanted to talk a little bit about them. So if anyone's unfamiliar with what GPTs are, they're custom AI models that are focused on specific tasks or topics that any user can now create just through having a natural language conversation with ChatGPT.
Rich, before you go in there, what does GPT actually stand for?
Generative. I can't. I should know.
Edit that out.
General purpose transformer, isn't it?
Purpose transformer. Yeah.
I think it's general purpose transformer. And sorry, the other question. So Dev Day, this was OpenAI's first Dev Day. Yeah. I think I'm right in saying, is that right?
Yeah. So and so this, when I'm talking about GPTs, this is a feature of of ChatGPT. So it's something that OpenAI have done, and so these GPTs that you can train, they have all of the new kind of the multi-modal abilities that Giles, you spoke about earlier. Plus, they can also call custom APIs and can be trained on custom knowledge. So for some of you that are maybe more familiar with coding solutions of AI and LangChain, calling custom APIs like connecting with Zapier or updating your own documents that contain your own knowledge. Those are all things that are starting to be built into ChatGPT and the web chat interface. And essentially it's, so I talked there about people that are making coding solutions, possibly knowing about how they would do this already. The point here is that anybody, even if you don't have programming skills now, that you can start to create these models.
So does that mean all the time I've spent learning how to do this is I can throw it out the window?
So yes and no. So I think what it actually does is it gives more options to developers, because you can either go down the now maybe slightly easier route of just using inbuilt functionality, and that means you can spend more of your time doing other things that are important, that create a lot of value for your business or kind of what you're working on. So you've got the option, but also you can still use the old way because you've got complete control over it, because you were dictating exactly how it was interacting with, say, the APIs or with knowledge bases at a level that you can't get just by the inherent capabilities of these new GPTs. So to give some examples of what I mean, or how GPTs might be used. So the example that they gave on Dev Day, it was actually, they created a GPT that acted as a coach for tech founders, but the possibilities for what you can create with a GPT are kind of almost endless. And I don't know if either of you noticed that a really funny example yesterday, it was Sam Altman. He roasted Elon and his new AI, which is called Grok. Okay. And he essentially just posted a screenshot showing him going through the creation process for a GPT. And he simply wrote in the instructions, be a chatbot that answers questions with cringy boomer humor in a sort of awkward, shock to get laugh sort of way, and then named it Guac.
Harsh but fair.
Yep. If anybody's seen any of the interactions with Guac that Elon's posted, that's kind of exactly how it replies, at least at the moment. But so if you think about the way I really like to think about the evolution here is, before, you might have wanted to customize your GPT if you were using the web chat interface, as by saying things like, pretend you are a teacher. And we've always talked about that as kind of prompting to get the AI to be the kind of person you want to talk to. But what GPTs now do is they're actually they ramp up that whole process. So now, instead of prompting and having to upload documents, the GPT can inherently be equipped with all of the material that it needs to have that conversation with you. So, for example, if you set one up as a teacher that needs to mark homework, you could equip it with all of the course material that it needed to help grade the papers. And it could also speak exactly like a teacher to give the final notes and marks as well, without having to set that up each and every time in a chat window in the web interface.
I mean, it's actually to echo back to stuff I was talking about. One of the things that Musk was saying was that one of the real benefits of AI was the fact that we could have our own personalized, very capable tutors on any subject. So it's that sort of follow on from what you're saying, I think.
Yep, and I think we're going to also see personalized tutors, but people are also probably going to want to try to replicate themselves as much as possible so that they can get away with submitting AI generated work as their own.
Well, I mean, actually, on a more kind of positive spin on the same thing, where you have experts in particular fields. So the example that Sam Altman gave actually in Dev Day was where he'd been doing loads of work with Y Combinator, and he'd given the same talk lots and lots of times, and actually creating effectively or encapsulating all of the knowledge that Sam Altman has about startups in an AI based on the materials that he's produced. Actually, it kind of is, from a consulting perspective, for example, allows you to create virtual versions of the consultants that always sell the project and never deliver it. So imagine having that person there delivering the project as well as selling it. It's going to be a revolution.
It could also potentially be part of a client onboarding process, whether you tell them or not. It's setting up a GPT that outputs how they expect things to be delivered to them.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I think that part is really interesting, where you start to clone humans essentially with their own unique knowledge and personalities and stuff.
So, Rich, does Dev Day mean that it's the end of AI startups?
That's a really good question, and so I was looking through some of the initial reactions to the Dev Day, and a lot of people were actually saying, "Is this the end? Is this the end of AI-based startups?" And I've got to admit that, as someone obviously working as a startup, kind of panicky, I went back through the announcements to see if I'd missed anything, because that isn't how I'd grasped all of the developments that they told us about. But this discussion about obsolescence is a very real one, and what people are talking about here is it's centering around AI startups that essentially are serving as thin layers on top of AI, so that they give it typically a distinct personality, and in some cases equipping it with very basic tools, but usually that's just in terms of uploading documents as knowledge bases. And I think for AI startups and businesses, it's actually really worth examining your value proposition in light of these updates. And it's not just about considering whether your current offerings are eclipsed, but it's whether they can withstand the test of upcoming innovations. So can they be eclipsed going forwards? And if you're listening to this as someone working for an AI-based business, I think it's important to ask yourself, does your product or service use AI to get better, or is it trying to make AI behave better? Because if AI improves your product, then updates are very likely to either improve your product or simplify your development of it, and you're always going to look forward to those updates. But if your product aims to try to improve AI, well, that's something that's going to happen naturally as large language models evolve, and that's something that is happening naturally. And so you're always going to need to kind of try to stay ahead of that. And that could end up being an exercise of kind of trying to tread water that increasingly gets harder. So I definitely think you should be thinking about how updates might affect your business in the long run. Not every enhancement will be quickly outdated. So there are some specialization. If you are making AI behave better, but it's for quite a niche or important specialization that's essential, that's in a niche, and that customers will always want an expert solution rather than the big generic large language model that probably doesn't care about Acme Limited. So you need to think about, are you operating in an area that's always going to need that, even if you're enhancing AI? But it's critical to be assessing this so that you get into a position where, when there are new updates by OpenAI and all of the other language models, that you're in a position where you're excited by them, because it means you can do more or save time rather than dreading them because it's just wiped out one of your departments, for example.
Yeah, I think what I find interesting about this is really what most of OpenAI's announcements in the dev day were about, them creating wrappers around the models. So originally it was just a straight, you call the model, you have to do all the work yourself. And what they're now doing is packaging it up to make it easier to consume for both technical and non-technical people. And so where startups were just doing that basic packaging, then the value is limited, because it's really just, I've got a little bit of technical know-how, and so I've been using my technical know-how to kind of improve it. So I would say, absolutely, the difference is if your product stands alone without the AI and then AI makes it better. I think I completely agree that that's really the test of a startup, which obviously InsightFlow falls into. I'd like to just observe the fact that we've now switched over to Virtual Rich, who's the clone of the real one, and his background has faded out completely, which I think is kind of exciting. Yeah. So,
unfortunately, it's just the closing in of the nights.
No one will have noticed. No one will have noticed the transition at all. It was seamless. But look at him, isn't he brilliant?
And do you know what? I'm not in a room at the moment that's got a smart bulb, so you see how useful they are. Could have just muted myself and said turn the light on.
Excellent. So we've heard obviously a little bit about. I'm going to be able to say it this time: multi-modal models, and how much of an impact they're going to have on the way that the world works. We have heard about the kind of impact and challenges for regulation and risk in AI, and we've heard about the OpenAI developer conference, which I think, and all of these things, I guess, really, to me, illustrate how quickly everything's changing, including my colleagues who are both virtual now, as far as I can tell. And on that note, I'm Giles.
I'm Rich.
And I've been Max Headgroup. No, I'm Graham.
I'm now Virtual Giles as well.